Story number 1.
The rain started just past midnight, tapping against the old Victorian house like ghostly fingers drumming on glass. The storm had been expected, but the wind carried a whisper through the trees, something softer than a howl, almost like voices. Ellen pulled her blanket closer around her shoulders, sinking into the worn armchair by the fireplace. She lived alone now. Her husband Mark had passed 3 months ago in a sudden accident on the road just outside their home. The grief was still raw, a gnawing presence in her chest that never seemed to fade. The house had been in Mark's family for generations, and even though he had warned her about its quirks, she never quite believed the stories. Shadows that moved when no one was there, cold spots in the halls, doors opening and closing on their own, it had all seemed like exaggerated family folklore. Until recently. She first noticed it the night after Mark's funeral. She had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling when she heard a sound downstairs, a soft shuffle like footsteps crossing the hardwood floor. Her breath caught in her throat and she had gripped the edge of her blanket. "Mark?" she had whispered, though she knew it couldn't be. The sound stopped and silence settled over the house once more. She convinced herself it was nothing, a figment of exhaustion, a side effect of grief. But over the next few weeks, more strange things happened. Doors that she had locked at night would be found open in the morning. The grandfather clock in the hallway, which hadn't worked in years, suddenly chimed at odd hours. And then there was the whispering. It would start just as she was falling asleep, a faint murmur, too soft to make out the words. At first, she thought it was the wind or maybe her own mind playing tricks on her. But one night, the whispering grew louder. "Ellen." She bolted upright in bed, had heart hammering in her chest. "Mark?" Silence. The house felt suffocating in the darkness, the air thick with something unseen, something watching. She turned on the bedside lamp, her hands shaking, and scanned the room. There was nothing there. And yet she could still feel it, that presence, that weight pressing down on her. It got worse after that. She started seeing things in the corners of her vision, dark shapes that would vanish the moment she turned to look. The scent of Mark's aftershave would suddenly fill the air, lingering as if he had just walked past her. And sometimes in the dead of night, she would wake to the feeling of someone sitting on the edge of the bed. She told herself she was imagining it, that it was all in her head. But the fear grew stronger, more undeniable with each passing day. Tonight, the storm outside did little to calm her nerves. She watched the fire flicker, the shadows dancing along the walls. The wind howled, rattling the windows. Then, in the silence between the gusts, she heard it again. Ellen. It was close this time. Right behind her. She spun around, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. There was nothing there. But the room had grown colder, the air heavy with something unseen. The lights flickered. A floorboard creaked near the doorway. Slowly, hesitantly, she stood up. The feeling of being watched was so strong that she didn't dare turn her back on the room. "Who's there?" she whispered. The whispering returned, a low murmur that sent ice through her veins. It sounded like multiple voices now, overlapping, weaving together in an eerie, unintelligible symphony. She backed away, her pulse pounding. Then the fire went out. Darkness swallowed the room, and she saw it, a shadow, tall and thin, standing just beyond the reach of the dying embers. Its form was wrong, too long, its limbs stretched as if it had been pulled from another world. Ellen stumbled back, gasping for air. The whispering grew louder. "Ellen, you have to leave." The voice was familiar this time. Mark's voice. Tears welled in her eyes. "Mark?" The shadow took a step closer. The darkness around it seemed to breathe, shifting unnaturally. "Leave. Now." The floor beneath her trembled. The walls groaned as if the house itself was alive, suffering. Then a scream, piercing, inhuman. Ellen turned and ran. She didn't stop until she reached the front door, fumbling with the lock. Her fingers were numb, shaking. The shadows moved in the hallway behind her, twisting like smoke. She yanked the door open and stumbled into the storm, the rain cold against her burning skin. For a moment, she hesitated, looking back at the house. The windows were dark, empty. But she could feel it still, watching, waiting. She ran. She didn't stop until she reached her neighbor's house, pounding on the door with all the strength she had left. When they opened it, she collapsed into their arms, sobbing. Ellen never went back to that house. A week later, it burned to the ground. The fire department said it was an electrical issue. But Ellen knew the truth. Some things are never meant to be disturbed. Some houses don't want to let go. Story the end.
Story number 2.
I never believed in ghosts. I thought people who swore by eerie tales and haunted houses were just looking for attention, or perhaps they were just too consumed by their own imaginations. That was before I moved into that house. The house was an old Victorian-style building located at the edge of a small town called Westbrook. I had been searching for a place to rent for months, and the moment I found this place, something about it called to me. It wasn't perfect, nothing was, but it was cheap. And there was something about the way it stood there, overgrown and withered, that gave me an odd sense of comfort. The landlord, Mr. Harris, seemed like a pleasant enough man. He told me the house had been vacant for years, but there were no issues with it. He just hadn't been able to find anyone willing to stay for long periods due to its reputation. He didn't elaborate on the reputation, but I wasn't the type to let rumors sway me. I moved in on a warm, sunny day, thinking I was simply getting an affordable roof over my head. The house had character: an old fireplace in the living room, wooden floorboards that creaked in all the right places, and a cozy little kitchen with antique cabinets. The wallpaper was peeling, but that was just part of the charm. It was a fixer-upper, and I enjoyed the idea of making it my own. Little did I know, I would never have the chance to fix the one thing that needed attention the most: the house itself. The first few nights were peaceful. The creaks and groans of an old house settling seemed natural, like breathing, and I fell asleep without a second thought. But then, around the third night, I started hearing things. Faint footsteps in the hallway, something dragging on the wooden floor. At first, I thought it was just the house. Houses make noises, don't they? But as the sounds grew louder and more distinct, my rational mind began to waver. I tried to tell myself it was the wind or maybe the house's old plumbing, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One evening, while I was sitting in the living room reading a book, the sound of footsteps grew so loud and deliberate that I stood up in a panic. The steps weren't coming from outside or from the neighbors. They were coming from upstairs. I hesitated, the air growing colder as the footsteps continued, slow and methodical. I couldn't explain why I was suddenly paralyzed with fear, but I knew I had to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way toward the staircase, my heart pounding in my chest. The stairs creaked beneath my weight, each step sounding like an echo in the otherwise silent house. When I reached the top, the hallway stretched out before me in darkness, the only light coming from the flashlight in my trembling hand. There was nothing. No one. Just the empty rooms and the oppressive quiet that hung in the air like a thick fog. But then I saw it. A shadow moved at the end of the hall, just outside one of the bedroom doors. It wasn't a person, though. The shape was darker than the surrounding shadows, its edges blurred, almost as if it was made from smoke or fog. My breath caught in my throat, and before I could think, I turned and bolted down the stairs. That night I barely slept, my eyes darting to every creak and groan, every subtle shift in the house. It felt like the house was alive, watching me, waiting for me to uncover whatever it was hiding. I called Mr. Harris the next morning and asked if there had ever been any incidents in the house, but he simply brushed it off, telling me I was just imagining things. He assured me it was just an old house with a lot of history. History. The next day, curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to dig a little deeper. The town's public records were easy to access, and after a few minutes of browsing, I found the history of the house. The original owner had been a man named Samuel Parker. He had moved to Westbrook in the early 1900s and built the house with his wife, Eleanor. They were well liked in the town until one fateful winter when both Samuel and Eleanor suddenly disappeared. The town was never able to solve their disappearance. Some believed they had simply left in the middle of the night, perhaps fleeing from something or someone. Others thought they had met with foul play, but no evidence of any crime was ever found. The house was left abandoned for years after that, and the rumors began to grow. It was said that Samuel had been obsessed with the house, spending hours in the attic, scribbling notes in a notebook, talking about visions he had seen and strange occurrences in the house. I didn't put much stock into the rumors. People love a good ghost story, but the more I read, the more unsettling the details became. Samuel and Eleanor had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only their belongings. It seemed too strange to be a coincidence. That night, after another restless evening of hearing footsteps and strange noises, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know more. Armed with the flashlight and the old notebook I had found in the attic, I went back upstairs, determined to get to the bottom of whatever was happening. The notebook was filled with erratic writing, scrawls of half-formed thoughts, ramblings about shadows, voices in the walls, and a growing sense of dread. Samuel had written about his wife's increasing paranoia. Eleanor had become convinced that there was something in the house, something evil, something ancient. Her handwriting was distinct from Samuel's, and reading through it made my skin crawl. It felt as though she was writing directly to me, warning me about the thing that had taken hold of their lives. It was then that I noticed something odd in the last pages of the notebook. A crude drawing of the house. In the corner of the page, there was a single line with the words, "It watches from the attic." I stood there, frozen, the words echoing in my mind. The attic. I had always avoided it. Something about the way it was tucked away at the top of the stairs had unnerved me. The ladder was old and rickety, and the small window in the corner let in only a sliver of light. But the thought of someone, watching from up there sent a chill through me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched as I climbed the narrow steps into the attic. The air grew colder the higher I climbed, and as I reached the top, I noticed a faint scratching noise coming from the far corner. The room was filled with old furniture, broken chairs, and dusty boxes that had clearly been left untouched for years. But it was the far corner that caught my attention. The small, shadowed space where the scratching seemed to be coming from. I hesitated for a moment, my heart racing, but I had come too far to turn back now. I approached the corner cautiously, the flashlight trembling in my hand. That's when I saw it. A figure, barely visible in the shadows, hunched over in the corner. Its back was to me, its arms hanging limply at its sides. It was silent, still, as though it was waiting for me to make the next move. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My body was frozen, rooted to the spot, and then the figure turned. Its face was pale, gaunt, its eyes hollow and dark. There was something wrong with its face, something twisted and grotesque, like it had been stretched or pulled. It opened its mouth, but there were no words, just a low, guttural sound. A growl, almost. I stumbled backward, nearly falling down the ladder in my haste to get away. I didn't stop running until I reached the front door, my legs shaking with fear. I didn't care about the things left behind. Furniture, clothes, everything I had brought into the house. I needed to leave. I slammed the door behind me, gasping for air, my body slick with sweat. That night, I packed everything I could fit into my car and left. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The house had a grip on me, and it was something I could never escape. I moved far away from Westbrook, and though I tried to bury the memory of the house, I could never forget the face I saw in the attic. I often wonder if Samuel and Eleanor ever truly left, or if something dark had claimed their souls. The house still stands in Westbrook, waiting for its next tenant. I hear it's been empty for years again, but I won't go near it. Story the end.
Story number 3.
I was never the type to believe in ghosts. Sure, I enjoyed a good horror movie now and then, and I had my fair share of childhood nightmares, but I always chalked it up to an overactive imagination. That was until I moved into the old house on Willow Street. It was an old Victorian-style home, the kind with creaky wooden floors and a wraparound porch that seemed to groan under the weight of even the slightest breeze. The rent was cheap, suspiciously cheap, but I wasn't in a position to question it. I was fresh out of college, barely scraping by, and the idea of a spacious home at such a low price was too good to pass up. The landlord, an older man named Mr. Davies, seemed relieved when I signed the lease. He didn't give me the usual pleasantries, just handed me the keys and muttered, "If you hear anything at night, just ignore it." I laughed, thinking he was trying to spook me, but his face was void of humor. I should have taken that as a warning. The first night was uneventful. I unpacked my things, ordered takeout, and settled in. The house had an odd energy to it, quiet yet not quite empty. It was as if the walls themselves were watching me, but I brushed it off. New places always feel strange at first. It wasn't until the third night that things took a turn. I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic creaking coming from downstairs. It sounded like someone pacing back and forth across the living room. My first thought was that someone had broken in. Heart pounding, I grabbed the heaviest object within reach, a metal flashlight, and crept down the stairs. The living room was empty. The kitchen was empty. Every door and window was locked. But the air was thick, heavy, like stepping into a room just after someone had been there. The scent of old wood and something faintly metallic lingered. I chalked it up to the house settling and went back upstairs, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me long after I turned off the lights. The next few nights were worse. The creaking returned, but this time it wasn't just pacing. It was footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate. I would lie in bed, gripping my blanket, as the sound climbed higher and higher, stopping just outside my bedroom door. One night, I worked up the nerve to call out, "Hello?" My voice was barely a whisper. Silence. Then, a knock. Not a loud bang, not the sound of wood expanding or contracting, but a single, deliberate knock right outside my door. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I convinced myself it had to be my imagination. Stress, exhaustion, something logical. But when I stepped into the hallway, my blood ran cold. There were footprints. Not dusty prints or marks left by shoes, but faint, wet footprints, as if someone had walked through a puddle and stood outside my room. The worst part? They weren't mine. I left for work in a daze, my mind racing with explanations. Maybe there was a leak somewhere. Maybe the floorboards absorbed moisture overnight. But no matter how many logical reasons I tried to come up with, none of them made sense. That evening, I decided to investigate. I scoured the house, looking for anything out of place. That's when I found it. In the basement. I hadn't spent much time down there, just enough to store a few boxes. It was colder than the rest of the house, the air damp and stale. The walls were lined with old wooden shelves, some filled with dusty jars and rusted tools, and in the far corner, partially hidden beneath an old tarp, was a door. It was small, barely big enough for a person to crawl through. The wood was warped with age, the handle rusted. My stomach twisted as I reached out and pulled it open. Behind it was a narrow passage leading deeper underground. The air that rushed out was thick with decay, the smell so strong it made my eyes water. I shined my flashlight inside, my pulse hammering. There, at the end of the passage, was a chair. A single wooden chair facing the wall. And on the wall, scratched deep into the stone, was a name. Michael. My breath hitched. I had no idea who Michael was. But the moment I saw that name, something in the air shifted. The house, the walls, the very ground beneath my feet, it felt like it was holding its breath. I slammed the door shut and ran upstairs. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the windows made my skin crawl. At exactly 3:12 a.m., I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Something was in my room. I felt it before I saw it, a cold presence, heavy and suffocating. My eyes darted to the doorway, and there, silhouetted against the darkness, was a figure. Tall, motionless, watching. The air turned frigid. My breath came out in ragged gasps, the pressure in the room pressing down on my chest. My instincts screamed at me to move, to run, but my body refused to listen. Then, it stepped forward. I don't remember what happened next. I must have passed out, because when I woke up, the room was empty, the door wide open. But the footprints were back, and this time, they led to my bed. That was the final straw. I packed my things that morning and left without looking back. I didn't bother telling the landlord. Something told me he already knew. A week later, I did some digging. The house had a history. In the early 1900s, it belonged to a man named Michael Carter. He was a recluse, rarely seen outside. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises at night, whispers, screams. One day, he simply vanished. When authorities searched the house, they found a hidden passage beneath the basement. Inside was a chair and scratches on the wall. No one knows what happened to Michael. Some say he went mad and sealed himself inside. Others believe something else took him. But one thing's for sure, he was never seen again. And now at night when I close my eyes, I still hear it. The slow, deliberate creak of footsteps climbing the stairs, stopping just outside my door. Knock, knock, knock.
Story number 4.
I first came across the house when I was walking through the neighborhood on a cold winter evening, searching for some peace after a hectic day. The house stood there like a forgotten relic, an old Victorian-style building with darkened windows that seemed to watch me as I walked by. There was something about it that drew me in, something that made my feet move closer, even though every instinct in my body screamed to keep walking. It was only when I stepped onto the cracked sidewalk near the house that I noticed the strange chill in the air. The night was unusually quiet. Even the streetlights, usually humming and buzzing in the distance, seemed to be silent. The house loomed above me, its tall, sharp roof stretching into the night sky, with a faded "for sale" sign hanging from the porch. I wasn't sure why it was still there. No one had moved in for years. Yet the house always seemed to be in perfect condition, as if someone was maintaining it in the shadows. I had heard rumors about it. Everyone in the neighborhood had. They said it was haunted, but most of the people who lived nearby would laugh it off, shrug it off as nothing more than gossip and superstition. I wasn't one for ghost stories, so I had always dismissed them. But that night, something felt different. My curiosity outweighed the growing sense of unease in my chest. I walked closer, my boots crunching on the snow-covered ground, and paused in front of the house's main door. The faded brass doorknob gleamed faintly in the light of the street lamp. My fingers tingled with the impulse to turn it. It wasn't locked, or at least it didn't feel locked, but I hesitated. I could already feel the strange presence in the air, a weight that pressed against me as if the house was waiting, watching for something. I turned around and began walking away, but just as I reached the corner, I heard something. A sound, a low creak, followed by what sounded like a whisper, barely audible against the wind. It was so faint that I thought I had imagined it. I stopped, glanced back at the house, and caught a glimpse of a figure in one of the upper windows. I froze. The figure was tall and slender, its features obscured in the shadows. It didn't move. It didn't blink. It was just standing there, watching me. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The whisper came again, louder this time. It was like a voice from deep within the house, calling to me, "Come inside." I couldn't ignore it. Something inside me compelled me to return to the house. My curiosity was too strong, and I found myself walking back toward the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The door creaked open, as if inviting me in. The house smelled musty, like old books and rotting wood, and the floors groaned under my weight as I stepped into the foyer. The air inside was colder than I expected, and I shivered, pulling my coat tighter around me. The house was eerily quiet, except for the faint rustling of what sounded like paper. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. No response, but there was no mistaking it. The whisper from earlier had come from this place. It was here, somewhere. I could feel it. I began to explore, stepping deeper into the house. The wallpaper was peeling off the walls, and the once gilded chandeliers were now covered in a thick layer of dust. The furniture was old, decayed, with moth-eaten cushions and sagging wood. Everything was still, frozen in time, as though the house had been abandoned for years, but there was a sense of life in it, a heartbeat that echoed just beneath the surface. As I walked through the hallway, my eyes caught sight of an old, tarnished mirror. I stopped in front of it, staring at my reflection. But as I gazed at myself, I noticed something strange. There was a shadow behind me, moving ever so slightly. I whipped around, but the hallway was empty. My breath caught in my throat. I turned back to the mirror, but the shadow remained. It was faint, flickering like a candle in the wind, but it was there. I could see it clearly now. It was the figure from the window, standing just behind me, its face a blur of dark features. I could feel its presence in the reflection, but when I turned, it was gone. Suddenly, the house felt smaller. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the whispering began again. This time, it wasn't a request. It was an order. "Leave?" It said, a harsh rasp in the air. "Leave now." I backed away from the mirror, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. I could feel my legs growing heavy, my feet unwilling to move. I tried to step toward the door, but the floorboards seemed to buckle beneath me. The temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath in the air, forming misty clouds that drifted away. "Leave now," the voice repeated, louder this time, coming from every corner of the room. I could hear it all around me, like 1,000 whispers blending into one. I stumbled toward the door, but the path was unclear. The house twisted in on itself. I was no longer sure which way I had come in. Every hallway I turned into seemed to lead to more darkness. The walls shifted, stretching, folding in on themselves. There were doors where there shouldn't have been, and windows that led into nothing but pitch-black voids. Panic gripped me. I had to get out, but no matter how many times I tried, I couldn't find the way back to the front door. The house felt alive, shifting and changing as if it were trying to trap me inside. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. "Leave," they urged, "before it's too late." I ran, my heart pounding, desperate to escape, but every door I tried was locked. The windows were sealed shut. I was trapped. It felt like hours before I finally stumbled into a small room at the back of the house, the one room that seemed untouched by time. It was cold but strangely clean, and in the center of the room was a rocking chair that moved slowly back and forth, creaking with every motion. And there, sitting in the chair, was the figure. It was tall, its face obscured by shadows, but I could feel its eyes on me, its cold, dark eyes. I froze, unable to move. The figure didn't speak, but I knew what it wanted. It wanted me to stay, to be part of the house, to become one of its whispers. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me in the room with the figure. The air grew thick, suffocating, and the whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. The figure was gone. The rocking chair stopped moving. The house, now empty and still, seemed to breathe around me. I didn't look back as I ran, bursting through the door and out into the freezing night. I didn't stop running until I reached my apartment, my heart racing in my chest, my body covered in cold sweat. The house was gone the next day, as if it had never existed. The for sale sign was no longer there, and when I asked around, no one remembered the house ever being there at all. It was like the entire thing had been erased from time itself. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. The house and the thing that lived inside of it are still out there, waiting, watching. And if you're not careful, it might call to you too. Story the end.
Story number 5.
I'd heard the rumors, of course. Everyone in town had. People spoke about the house on Birch Street as though it were cursed. It wasn't much to look at, just a standard 2-story home, the kind you'd expect to see in any suburban neighborhood. But there was always something unsettling about it, something that made it stand out among the others. The house had been empty for years, but its reputation had lingered long after the previous owners had disappeared. Some said they'd been driven mad by the strange happenings in the house. Others claimed they just packed up and left one night, never to return. Whatever the truth, the house had been abandoned for so long that weeds had begun to overtake the yard, and the windows had started to fog over with dust and grime. But the rumors weren't what made me decide to move in. I had just gotten out of a bad relationship and was looking for a fresh start. I wasn't exactly swimming in money, and the house on Birch Street was cheap, almost too cheap. The landlord, a gruff old man who barely said 2 words to me, seemed more than eager to get rid of it. He never asked for a deposit or even a credit check. It was as if he just wanted to be rid of the place. At first, I didn't think much of it. I was looking for a quiet place to heal, a place where I could focus on getting back on my feet. The house seemed like the perfect solution. The neighbors were far enough away to give me some peace and quiet, and the house itself, while old and worn, had a certain charm. The wooden floors creaked with age, the walls were covered in floral wallpaper, and the fireplace still worked, despite how cold the nights were beginning to get. It wasn't until the first night that things started to feel off. I had been unpacking all day, and by the time the sun set, I was exhausted. I decided to call it a night and went to bed early. The house, though chilly, was peaceful, and I found comfort in the stillness of it. But around 2 a.m, I was awoken by a sound that I couldn't ignore. It was soft at first, like the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the hall. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. I was alone, wasn't I? There was no reason for anyone to be in the house. The landlord had given me the keys, and I hadn't heard any knocks on the door since moving in. The footsteps grew louder, closer, I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, the old wooden beams creaking under the weight of the night air. But there was something deliberate about the steps, like someone was pacing the hall outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps paused, and for a moment, there was silence. Then I heard something else, whispers. Low, indistinct murmurs that seemed to be coming from the hallway, just on the other side of the door. I should have gotten up to check. I should have opened the door and looked around, but I couldn't move. I felt paralyzed by an invisible weight pressing down on my chest, as if something was in the room with me, watching me. And then, without warning, the door creaked open. Slowly. Carefully. I didn't even have time to react before the dark shape of a figure appeared in the doorway. It was a woman. She stood there, just beyond the threshold, her features obscured by the shadows. Her hair was dark, hanging down in loose strands around her face, and her clothes were old-fashioned, like something from the 1920s. But her eyes were what I couldn't look away from. They were wide open, unblinking, and they stared at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I couldn't speak. I couldn't scream. All I could do was watch as she took a slow step into the room, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet. She didn't move quickly, didn't rush toward me. She simply stood there, frozen in place, watching me. And then as suddenly as she appeared, she was gone. The door slammed shut, and the whispers faded into the silence of the night. I sat there in bed, trembling. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what had just happened. I must have imagined it, I thought. It had to be a dream or some trick of the light. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. I knew what I'd felt. That presence, it had been real. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. I told myself I was just adjusting to the new house, that the stress of moving had gotten to me. But something about the place lingered in my thoughts. I couldn't stop thinking about the woman, her eyes, the coldness that seemed to hang in the air whenever she appeared. As the days passed, I began to notice more strange things. Items would go missing, only to reappear in odd places. The lights flickered constantly, even though I had replaced all the bulbs. And sometimes at night, I would hear the sound of something scraping against the walls, something long and sharp, like fingernails dragging down the surface. One afternoon, I decided to explore the attic. I had heard rumors from the neighbors that the attic was where the previous owner had spent most of his time. He'd been a reclusive man, some said, always to himself, never interacting with anyone. I figured there had to be something up there, some clue as to what had happened in the house. I climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, my flashlight illuminating the cobweb-covered corners. The air up there was thick with dust, and the floorboards groaned under my weight. As I moved further into the attic, I noticed a large chest in the corner, its lid slightly ajar. It didn't seem to belong to the previous owner, not from what I'd heard, but something about it felt important. I opened the chest. Inside was a collection of old photographs, yellowed with age. The pictures were mostly of families, smiling faces staring out at me from the past. But in the back of the chest, buried under the photos, was something else. A small, delicate box. It was ornate, covered in carvings of roses and vines, and it felt unusually warm to the touch. I opened it. Inside the box was a ring, a plain silver band with a small but intricate design etched into the surface. It seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of the attic. I couldn't explain it, but I felt a connection to the ring. As soon as I touched it, I knew it wasn't meant to be found. But I didn't understand why. The whispers returned that night, louder than ever before. They swirled around me like a storm, pressing in on all sides, pulling me toward the center of the house. I couldn't escape them. I couldn't block them out. They grew louder, more urgent. And then, through the whispers, I heard a voice. Soft and calm, yet filled with an undeniable sense of finality. Put it back. The voice was coming from somewhere deep within the house, but I couldn't tell where. I tried to ignore it, but the force of the command was overwhelming. I had no choice but to return to the attic, to return the ring to where it belonged. When I got there, the chest was gone. The photographs were scattered around the attic as though someone had rifled through them. The box was missing too. And in its place, there was only the woman. She stood in the center of the attic, staring at me with those cold, hollow eyes. And this time, she spoke. "You shouldn't have taken it," she whispered. Now you're part of the story. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, the air growing thick with an almost suffocating heaviness. I could feel her presence, feel her anger rising, and I knew, deep down, that I would never leave the house. I woke up the next morning in my bed, drenched in sweat. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping outside, and everything seemed normal. But the house was different. It was quieter now, as though the air had been sucked out of it. I left the house that day. I packed up my things as quickly as I could and never looked back. I've heard rumors about the house on Birch Street, that it still stands, waiting for someone else to move in, but I'll never go near it again. And I'll never forget the woman in the attic. Her eyes, her whispering voice, and the feeling that she's still watching, waiting for someone else to take the ring. Story, the end.
Story number 6.
I was only 22 when I moved into the apartment on Oak Street. It was a modest one-bedroom in an old building that had been around since the late 1800s. The rent was cheap, and it seemed like the perfect place to get started in life after moving to the city for work. I didn't pay much attention to the history of the building or the odd rumors I heard when I toured the place. The landlord, an elderly woman named Mrs. Fields, mentioned in passing that the building had been through several renovations over the years, but she didn't get into details. She was kind, but something about her always seemed slightly off, like she was holding something back. The apartment itself wasn't much to look at: cracked walls, creaky floors, and a small kitchen with outdated appliances. But I didn't mind. It had character, and I liked the idea of living in a place with a history. The neighbors were quiet, and the area was relatively peaceful, despite being in the heart of the city. The only strange thing was the old woman who lived in the unit across from mine. She never came out during the day, but every evening I'd see her standing by her window, watching the street below. Her eyes would follow me as I walked past, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was always staring at me. I didn't think too much of it at first. After all, some people just like to watch the world go by. But as the days went on, I began to notice little things about the apartment that seemed odd. The temperature in the unit fluctuated wildly, even when the heat was on full blast. The windows rattled as if someone was knocking on them from the outside, though there was no one there. And sometimes, when I was sitting in the living room, I'd hear the faint sound of footsteps above me, even though I was on the top floor. At first, I brushed it off as the building settling. But then, one night, I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange sound. It was a soft scratching, like fingernails dragging across the floor. It was coming from the hallway outside my apartment door. I lay still, listening, trying to convince myself that it was just the pipes or the wind. But then I heard it again. Closer this time. It was unmistakable. Someone or something was moving outside my door. I waited for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest, before I finally gathered the courage to get up. I crept over to the door and slowly peeked through the peephole. I couldn't see anyone, but the hallway was dark and the air felt unnaturally cold. My breath came out in small clouds as I stood there, wondering if I should open the door. But something told me not to. The scratching stopped, and the silence that followed was even more unsettling. I decided to go back to bed, but the unease lingered. It took me hours to fall asleep again, and when I finally did, my dreams were strange and unsettling. I dreamed of the old woman across the hall, standing in front of my apartment door, her eyes glowing in the darkness. The next morning, I woke up exhausted, but I tried to shake off the strange experience. I went about my day as usual, but the feeling of being watched never quite left me. The apartment felt heavier somehow, as if something was pressing down on me. That evening, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to clear my mind. As I passed by the old building, I glanced up at the window where the old woman always stood. This time, she wasn't there. I felt a strange relief, but as I continued walking, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just the stress of moving into a new place. But then, as I rounded the corner, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, standing at the end of the street, was the old woman. Her back was turned to me, and she was facing the building, her head tilted slightly, as though she was listening to something. I froze, watching her for a moment, wondering how she had gotten there so quickly. I hadn't seen her leave the building, and I certainly hadn't heard her footsteps. I took a step forward, and she turned around. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes were wide, unblinking. She stared at me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. I was about to say something, ask her if she was okay, but before I could speak, she turned around and started walking away, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't look back. I watched her walk down the street until she disappeared around the corner. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened, but I couldn't make sense of it. Something about it felt wrong, like I had just witnessed something I wasn't supposed to see. That night, as I lay in bed, I tried to push the encounter out of my mind. But then, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard it again. The faint scratching sound in the hallway. It was louder this time, closer. My heart raced as I sat up, wide awake, straining to listen. The scratching stopped, but then I heard something else, something worse. A voice, soft and raspy, coming from just outside my door. "Let me in." I froze, not daring to move. The voice was familiar, and it sent a shiver down my spine. It sounded like the old woman, but her voice was different. It was broken, distorted, as though she was speaking from behind a wall. The door handle rattled. I jumped back, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, trying to figure out if I should call for help or stay quiet and wait for it to stop. The door handle continued to rattle, the voice growing louder and more frantic. "Let me in! Let me in!" I couldn't move. I just sat there, paralyzed with fear, as the sound of scratching and the distorted voice filled the air. The temperature in the room dropped, and I could see my breath fogging up in front of me. I had to get out of there, but my legs felt like lead. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. I waited for what felt like an eternity, too terrified to move. Finally, I mustered the courage to get up. I tiptoed to the door and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty. There was no sign of the old woman, but something else caught my eye. At the end of the hallway, the door to the apartment across from mine was open just a crack. The woman's apartment. I had never seen the door open before. I didn't want to investigate, but something was pulling me toward it. I stepped into the hallway, my footsteps quiet against the wooden floor. As I approached the door, I could hear soft sobbing from inside. It was the old woman's voice, barely audible, but unmistakable. I knocked softly, but there was no answer. The sobbing continued, growing louder, as though she was right there on the other side of the door, just beyond my reach. I couldn't help myself. I pushed the door open. The apartment was empty, but the air inside was thick with an overpowering sense of dread. The walls were covered in old photographs, yellowed with age, and the furniture was arranged in a strange, almost ritualistic manner. In the center of the room was a chair facing the wall, and on the floor next to it, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. A ring. A simple silver band. I picked it up, my fingers trembling. It felt cold to the touch, and as soon as I held it, the air around me seemed to grow even colder. The sobbing stopped. The apartment fell silent. I didn't know what to make of it, but something told me to leave. I put the ring back on the floor and stepped away from the chair. But as I turned to leave, I heard the door to the hallway slam shut. I rushed back to my apartment, my heart pounding in my chest. I locked the door behind me and sank to the floor, gasping for breath. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew one thing for certain. The old woman was not just a normal resident of the building. She was something else, something that had been waiting for me. That night, I left. I packed my things and never looked back. The building on Oak Street still stands, but I'll never go near it again. I've heard that the old woman still watches from her window, waiting for someone to make the same mistake I did. Story the end.
Story number 7.
It was an old house. Too old, really, for anyone to want to live in it. The kind of house that had an air of history about it, a history that most people would rather forget. But when I first saw it, I wasn't thinking about ghosts or curses. I was looking for a place to get away from the chaos of my life, a quiet spot where I could focus on my work without distractions. I had just gotten a job in the city, and after a few months of couch surfing with friends, I found the listing for a small cottage on the outskirts of town. The rent was cheap, and the house was secluded. It seemed perfect. The landlord, a thin, middle-aged man named Mr. Jacobs, seemed eager to show me the place when I called. He didn't waste any time giving me the tour. He was almost too eager, if that makes sense. The moment I stepped inside, he started talking about how the house had been in his family for generations. He mentioned the history of the property, how it had been built in the early 1900s, but he didn't say much more about it than that. I was more interested in the house itself, the wooden floors, the tall ceilings, the fact that it was mostly untouched by modern renovations. It had character, and I could already imagine myself living there, working on my projects, escaping the noise of the world. But as I signed the lease and Mr. Jacobs handed me the keys, he gave me a strange look, a kind of pity that I couldn't quite place. He didn't say anything, but there was an unspoken warning in his gaze, something that made my stomach twist. I shrugged it off. I didn't believe in ghosts, and I didn't care much for old superstitions. I had a life to rebuild, and this house, with its peeling wallpaper and cracked windows, was going to be my fresh start. The first few nights were peaceful. The house was far from perfect. There were drafts in the windows, and the plumbing made strange noises, but I didn't mind. I spent my days working from home, writing, reading, getting to know the small town I had moved to. The neighbors were friendly but distant, and I rarely saw anyone except for a few people walking dogs or driving by in cars. It was a quiet existence, and for the first time in a long time, I was content. But that changed one night, a few weeks after I moved in. It was late, well past midnight, and I was finishing up some work when I heard it. At first, it was faint, a whispering sound, like voices coming from somewhere deep in the house. I thought it was just the wind or the creaking of the house settling. But then the sound grew louder, more distinct, until I could make out words. I couldn't understand them, but they were there. Soft, insistent whispers, as if someone was speaking right next to me. I froze, my heart racing. I wasn't used to hearing voices. Not like this. I got up from my desk and walked through the house, trying to find the source of the sound. It seemed to be coming from the attic, which I had never bothered to explore. The door to the attic was old and warped, and I never really thought much about it. But now, as I stood at the bottom of the stairs, I felt an odd sense of dread. I don't know what made me do it, but I opened the door. The attic was dark and musty, filled with the smell of old wood and dust. There was nothing unusual about it, just piles of boxes and old furniture covered in sheets. But the whispers grew louder as I stepped inside, and they seemed to be coming from the far corner of the room. My flashlight flickered as I moved toward the sound, my breath catching in my throat. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, something that moved in the corner of my eye. But when I turned to look, there was a figure standing in the far corner of the attic. It was tall, almost skeletal, with a long coat that hung loosely around its frame. The face was hidden in the darkness, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold, empty, watching. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a low, guttural sound like someone was breathing heavily in the dark. I don't know what it was, but I knew I had to get out of that attic. I ran downstairs, slammed the door shut behind me, and locked it. I spent the rest of the night in my room, too scared to sleep, too terrified to even move. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear that breathing, that sense of being watched. The next morning, I went to the local diner for breakfast, hoping to shake off the fear that had settled in my bones. The waitress, an older woman with a friendly smile, seemed to know exactly what I needed. She brought me a cup of coffee and asked how I was settling into the house. "It's a beautiful place," I said, trying to sound casual. Quiet, peaceful. Her smile faded slightly, and she looked over her shoulder before leaning in a little closer. "Just be careful up there," she said softly. "The house has a way of getting inside your head. You're not the first person to hear things, and you won't be the last." I tried to laugh it off, but the words stuck with me. What did she mean by that? Had others heard the whispers? Had they seen the figure in the attic? Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about the house. The whispers continued, sometimes in the attic, sometimes in other parts of the house. It was always at night, always when the house was completely still. But what bothered me most was the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just in the attic anymore. It was everywhere. One night, as I sat in my living room, I saw something move in the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but when I turned to look, there was a shadow standing by the window. A figure, just like the one I had seen in the attic. My heart raced as I stood up, my mind screaming for me to run, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, staring at the shadow, unable to look away. Then, the figure stepped forward and I could see it more clearly. It was the same tall, skeletal shape, but now its face was visible. Hollow eyes, a twisted grin, and skin that looked like it had been stretched too thin over its bones. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, staring at me. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed with fear. Eventually, the figure faded back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. I stood there for a moment longer, my heart pounding in my chest just before I ran to the door and out into the yard. I don't know how long I stood outside, but it felt like hours. The cold night air did nothing to calm my nerves. I was shaken, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had just seen. But even as I stood there, I could still feel the presence of that thing, watching from the window, waiting for me to return inside. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I stayed up, pacing around the yard until the sun began to rise. When morning finally came, I packed my things and left the house. I didn't care if it meant breaking my lease or disappointing Mr. Jacobs. I couldn't stay there another night. The house had gotten inside my head, just like the waitress had warned me, and I wasn't willing to find out what would happen next. I never spoke to Mr. Jacobs again. I moved into a new apartment, one with no history, no whispers, no shadows lurking in the dark. But sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear that breathing, the low whispers, and the cold eyes watching from the darkness.
Story number 8.
I moved to the small town of Marlow, a place I had never intended to settle, but found myself there all the same. I had been driving cross-country for months, following no particular direction, running from a life that I felt had trapped me in its confines. I wasn't sure what I was searching for, but I thought I'd know it when I saw it. And when I saw the for rent sign outside the old Victorian house, something inside me clicked. The rent was reasonable, the house was charming in its dilapidated way, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I could breathe again. The town itself was quiet. It wasn't the kind of place you would pass through by accident. You had to be looking for Marlow, and even then it was easy to miss. The streets were lined with old oak trees, the houses were spaced far apart, and there wasn't much to do beyond taking long walks or chatting with the handful of friendly faces at the local diner. Still, I found comfort in the isolation. It felt like the perfect spot to disappear, to find some peace. The house was an old 2-story with weathered bricks, a sagging porch, and a front door that creaked with age. The windows were covered in a thick layer of dust, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. But it had character. It had seen years, maybe even decades of life, and now it felt like it was waiting for someone to breathe life into it again. I met the landlord, Mrs. Hargrove, a woman in her late 60s with wispy silver hair and a voice that was as brittle as the paint on the house. She was kind, but there was an uneasiness about her, like she was holding something back. Her eyes darted nervously whenever she spoke about the house, but she never offered any real explanation as to why. She handed me the keys with a tight-lipped smile and hurried off as if there was somewhere she'd rather be. At first, everything seemed perfect. The house was quiet, the town was peaceful, and I quickly settled into my new routine. My days consisted of unpacking boxes, getting to know the little quirks of the house, like the way the stairs creaked, the way the attic door always stuck, or the odd drafts that would drift through certain rooms, no matter how warm it was outside. I told myself it was just the age of the place, that nothing more sinister was going on. But then, strange things started to happen. It began slowly, almost imperceptibly. At first, it was just the odd sound, a distant creak or a whisper that I thought I had imagined. I brushed it off, attributing it to the house settling or the wind blowing through the cracks in the windows. But the noises grew more frequent. I started hearing footsteps in the hallway at night, slow, deliberate footsteps that seemed to echo from upstairs. I would check, but there was no one there. and it wasn't just the sound of footsteps. Sometimes I would hear someone calling my name, faint at first, as if from far away. Other times, the soft sound of someone crying would drift through the walls, a muffled sobbing that sent chills down my spine. The first time I tried to ignore it, I convinced myself that I was just being paranoid. I had recently moved to a new place, and change always made me feel a little off balance. But the longer it went on, the harder it was to ignore. The whispers seemed to grow clearer, more insistent. I began to notice things out of place, small things like objects that would be moved when I was certain I had left them in one place. A book I had left on the coffee table would be on the floor the next morning. My favorite mug, which I always left on the kitchen counter, would be in the sink. It was subtle at first, but the patterns began to form. I tried to talk to Mrs. Hargrove about it, but when I mentioned the noises, she gave me a look I couldn't quite place. It was almost a mix of pity and warning. She told me that the house had a history, but she didn't elaborate. She then changed the subject, talking instead about the weather or how the flowers in her garden were doing. There was something about the way she avoided the topic that made my unease grow. I asked the neighbors about the house, but they all seemed hesitant, as though they knew something they weren't willing to share. The only thing I could gather from them was that the house had been empty for many years, that Mrs. Hargrove was its third owner in the past decade, and that none of the previous tenants had stayed for long. One evening, after another restless night, I decided to explore the attic. I had avoided it at first because of the musty smell and the strange sense of dread I felt whenever I looked at the attic door. It was an old wooden door with a brass handle that was worn smooth from years of use. But tonight, I could no longer ignore it. I needed to understand what was happening in this house. I grabbed a flashlight and ascended the narrow staircase that led to the attic. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the scent of dust and decay hitting me immediately. The attic was dimly lit, with only a small window that let in a sliver of moonlight. The walls were lined with old trunks, boxes, and discarded furniture covered in white sheets. I ran my hand over one of the trunks and noticed it was surprisingly warm, despite the chill in the air. The air itself felt heavier up here, as if something was watching me. I moved slowly, careful not to disturb anything. As I reached the far corner of the attic, I found something I hadn't expected, a rocking chair. It was old, made of dark wood, and had a faded cushion on the seat. The chair looked completely out of place, like it had been left there deliberately. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the better of me. I walked over to it and touched the armrest. The moment my fingers brushed against the wood, the rocking chair started to move, slowly at first, then faster, as if an invisible hand was rocking it. I stumbled back, my heart racing. I tried to convince myself it was just a draft, that the house was simply settling, but the longer I watched, the more unnerved I became. The chair continued to rock, and then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that made my blood run cold, a figure standing in the doorway. At first, I thought it was Mrs. Hargrove, but when I looked more closely, I saw that the figure wasn't human. It was a shadow, dark and formless, with an outline that seemed to waver in and out of existence. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. My mind screamed for me to run, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, staring at the figure, which seemed to grow taller, more solid, the longer I looked at it. The air around me grew colder, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. The whispers, which I had tried so hard to ignore, began again, this time louder, clearer, right in my ear. The voice was faint, but it was unmistakable. It was calling my name. I turned and bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the stairs, I could hear the rocking chair still moving behind me, the creaking sound echoing in my ears. I didn't stop running until I was back downstairs, panting, my hands shaking uncontrollably. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My mind raced, trying to justify what I had seen, but deep down I knew I couldn't explain it away. The house had changed in a way that I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just an old house. It was a place that had memories, dark ones that didn't want to be forgotten. In the days that followed, I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. The whispers grew more persistent, more aggressive. I began to see things out of the corner of my eye, shadows moving, figures standing just out of sight. The temperature in the house fluctuated wildly, sometimes freezing cold and other times unbearably hot. I knew something had to be done, but I didn't know where to turn. The house had its grip on me, and the more I tried to ignore it, the more it pushed back. It wasn't until I found an old newspaper article buried in the attic about a family that had lived in the house decades ago that I began to understand. The article spoke of a tragic fire that had claimed the lives of the family's children. They had died in their sleep, suffocated by smoke while the parents had managed to escape. It was then that I realized the house wasn't just old, it was haunted. The spirits of the children had never left, and they were angry, restless. I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I packed my things and left the house behind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, that the spirits I had encountered in that house were still with me, haunting my every step. I moved to a different town, started over, but every so often, when the wind is just right, I still hear the whispers. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still see the figure in the doorway, watching me, waiting. Story the end.